For 5 long years, Ethan Harper, a wealthy CEO, carried flowers to his wife's grave, his heart locked in grief, his world frozen in silence. Every Monday, the cemetery became his prison of sorrow where memories whispered louder than the wind. But everything changed the day a barefoot little girl appeared among the tombstones. Her eyes, bright and hauntingly familiar, pierced through his despair. With a trembling voice, she whispered words that shattered his reality. "She's alive. I can prove it." In that moment, Ethan's life split open, torn between fear of cruel illusion and a desperate longing for hope. Could it be true? Could the love he buried still be breathing somewhere in the world? This is not just a story about loss. It's about second chances, family, and the courage to believe again. Stay with us and subscribe to Hidden Echo Stories for more unforgettable tales. Ethan Harper moved through the world like a man carrying a wound no one could see. To anyone passing him on the street, he was the image of success. Sharp suit, polished shoes, the kind of calm authority that turned heads. But every Monday morning, when the city of Charleston began its week with the hum of traffic and the rustle of office doors, Ethan slipped into a different rhythm, one defined not by ambition but by grief. Oakwood Cemetery had become his sanctuary and his prison. Its old oaks stretched out like weary guardians, branches trailing moss that swayed like forgotten memories. The gravel path crunched under his shoes as he made the same walk he had made for 5 years, always with blue hydrangeas in his hands. They were Leia's favorite, and though he never let them wilt, his spirit had withered with each passing season. The headstone was as familiar as his reflection. Leia Harper, beloved wife and daughter. Beneath her name, the tiny oval photograph showed her laughing, eyes sparkling the shade of sea glass. Ethan touched it every time he came, tracing her smile with a finger that trembled more now than it did years ago. The world had split for him the day she disappeared. There was a before, filled with possibility and warmth, and an after where each breath was a negotiation with emptiness. He never saw her body, never touched her one last time, but everyone had insisted the accident left no doubt. Friends urged him to move forward, to let go, to build a new life. He did not. He clung to ritual instead, as though the act of bringing flowers could tether her spirit to him. On that morning the air was crisp, autumn settling in with the scent of salt from the harbor and the faint promise of rain. Ethan stood at the grave, placing the bouquet carefully into the vase. He whispered to her the way a man speaks to the memory of his own heart. "Hey, Leia, I brought you the blue ones again. You always said they looked like bits of the sky." He tried to smile, but it twisted into a grimace. His voice faltered. 5 years feels like yesterday, but also like forever. Am I living or just existing? He pressed his palm flat against the stone, the coldness seeping into his skin, reminding him again that she was gone and nothing he did could change it. The minutes bled into one another as they always did. Sometimes he confessed his fears. Sometimes he sat in silence until the sun climbed higher. He told her about the hollow mornings at his breakfast table, about the house that echoed with loneliness, about the empire he built that felt like sand slipping through his fingers. He admitted he was afraid, afraid to let go of the only ritual that kept him tethered to her. The grave had become his anchor, even if it dragged him deeper into despair. That day something shifted. A sound broke through the stillness, not the heavy tread of another mourner or the creak of a groundskeeper's cart, but a lighter step, hesitant yet determined. Ethan stiffened, brushing quickly at his eyes, forcing his face into the mask of composure he wore so well in boardrooms. "If you're looking for the caretaker," he called out without turning, "he's usually—" His words stopped when he glanced over his shoulder. A girl stood a few yards away. Barefoot, hair a wild tangle of golden curls, her dress frayed at the edges. She looked no older than 6, but her eyes, startling green, luminous even in the gray light, held a weight that belonged to someone much older. For a moment Ethan thought his grief had conjured her, a phantom child pulled from the void of longing. "Sweetheart," he said cautiously, "are you lost? Where are your parents?" She hugged her arms around herself and shook her head. Her gaze drifted to the headstone, then back to him, unblinking. When she finally spoke, her voice was a whisper, yet it cleaved through the air like a bell. "She's alive. I can prove it. The words struck him harder than any blow. His hand opened and the bouquet tumbled, blue petals scattering across the grass. His chest tightened, pulse thundering in his ears. He searched the girl's face, his mind lurching between fury, disbelief, and a desperate spark of hope. "What did you say?" His voice cracked, harsher than he intended. But the girl did not flinch. She stared at him with eyes that mirrored the woman etched into the gravestone photograph. "My mom sent me." Ethan's knees threatened to give way. He clutched the granite for balance, feeling the world tilt beneath him. Logic screamed that this was a cruel trick, that someone was preying on his weakness. Yet his heart, starved of hope for so long, leapt toward the impossible. He knelt to the girl's level, trying to soften his voice. "Why would you say that about my wife? Do you know her?" The girl hesitated, then brushed back a curl to reveal a crescent-shaped scar above her eyebrow. Ethan's breath caught. Leia had carried the same scar since childhood. "Mom says my scar makes me special, just like hers," the girl said quietly. Ethan's hands shook as she reached into her pocket and pulled out a worn photograph. She held it out with both palms. He took it, his fingers trembling. The image was grainy but unmistakable. Leia, thinner, older, holding the same girl on her lap. Her eyes, the same sea-glass green, stared at him through the paper. For a moment Ethan forgot to breathe. He dropped heavily to the ground, the picture clutched to his chest, grief and longing twisting into something new, something terrifying. Could it be true? After all the years, after all the tears, could Leia still be alive? The girl's name was Maddie. She told him her mother had sent her here to this very place because she knew he would come. Ethan listened in stunned silence, each word a strike against the walls of his disbelief. Memories of the accident flooded back, phone calls unanswered, the swollen river swallowing any trace, the death certificate signed under pressure. He had always carried a seed of doubt, a whisper that maybe, just maybe, the story was not complete. And now this child stood before him, carrying proof. Ethan's world, once defined by routine and sorrow, cracked open that morning. He looked at Maddie and saw not just a child but a key to a truth he had long buried. When she reached for his sleeve and whispered, "Come with me. She wants to see you. She says it's time," Ethan felt his resistance crumble. Against every instinct of caution, against every fear of being deceived, he rose and followed. For the first time in 5 years, he let himself imagine the possibility of something he thought was lost forever: hope. Ethan's mind spun in chaos as he followed the barefoot child through the gates of the cemetery. The sound of gravel crunching beneath his shoes seemed louder than the beat of his heart, which pounded like a drum against his ribs. Maddie walked with surprising confidence for someone so young, her small figure darting ahead, curls bouncing with each step. She clutched the faded photograph to her chest, as though it were both shield and compass. Ethan trailed behind, torn between the fear of being deceived and the undeniable tug of hope that burned inside him like a flame newly lit after years of darkness. At his car, Maddie paused, studying the sleek black sedan as if it were a foreign object from another world. Ethan opened the passenger door for her, his hands still trembling. "Are you sure about this?" he asked, his voice low, more to himself than to her. Maddie nodded simply. "She's waiting." Those two words carried a gravity that made Ethan's throat tighten. He slid behind the wheel, his polished composure stripped away, replaced by the uncertainty of a man who stood at the edge of something both miraculous and dangerous. As the car moved through the streets of Charleston, Ethan's thoughts chased themselves in relentless circles. The accident replayed in fragments, flashing lights, voices on radios, the cruel sound of rushing water. Everyone told him to accept the truth, but he had never seen her body, had never laid her to rest in a way that made sense. Now this child, with her sea-green eyes and crescent scar, was tearing open wounds he thought had calcified into numbness. He glanced at her in the rearview mirror. She sat quietly, her small hands folded over the photograph, her expression far too solemn for a child. Every detail about her whispered of Leia, as though she carried pieces of his lost wife stitched into her being. The drive stretched out like a dream. Maddie sometimes pointed at turns, her voice steady, though her bare feet swung nervously against the seat. At one stoplight, Ethan dared to ask, "How far is it?" Maddie counted softly on her fingers before answering, "About half an hour. I usually walk, but it is faster in a car." Ethan gripped the wheel tighter, stunned by the thought of this little girl wandering alone through streets with only impossible news to guide her. It made his chest ache in ways he had not felt in years. When they finally pulled up to his home, Ethan felt the weight of contradiction pressing down on him. The house was everything he had once thought success meant: glass and steel, sleek lines, wide open spaces, an architectural marvel fit for magazines. But as he ushered Maddie inside, the silence that had once been a comfort now roared with emptiness. The walls gleamed white, the floors polished to perfection, yet there was no warmth, no trace of life. Maddie spun once in the entryway, her small voice echoing in the high ceilings. "It is really big," she said with a mixture of awe and hesitation. Ethan watched her, realizing suddenly how absurdly sterile the house was. A place made for display, not for living. He offered her food, fumbling with the unfamiliar task of cooking for someone other than himself. He scrambled eggs, made toast, poured juice into a crystal glass meant for wine. Maddie sat at the counter, feet swinging, watching him with quiet attentiveness. When he placed the plate in front of her, her smile lit the room more than any chandelier. She ate carefully, as though each bite mattered, leaving nothing behind. Ethan, with his black coffee, found himself watching her mannerisms, how she chewed slowly, how she kept glancing at him with those green eyes, how she carried herself like someone used to making do with little. It stirred something deep, a mix of sorrow and admiration. At one point she asked, without preamble, "Do you always eat alone?" Ethan froze, caught off guard by the bluntness. He admitted softly, "Most of the time, yes." Maddie tilted her head, her brows knitting. "Isn't it lonely?" The question landed harder than any accusation could. He looked away, out the window at the immaculate but lifeless backyard, and felt the answer lodge in his chest. "Sometimes," he whispered. The truth was heavier than the silence that followed. They lingered in the kitchen, the faint scent of eggs and toast filling the air, a fragile normalcy he had not known he missed. Maddie spoke of her mother in pieces, little fragments that wove a picture Ethan could barely comprehend. Leia had been sick but was stronger now. They had lived simply, sometimes with little to eat. Yet Maddie spoke with resilience, not complaint, her small voice carrying both innocence and wisdom. She described nights when her mother read to her, mornings when she sang while cooking, and the way she always mentioned Ethan's kindness. Each word pierced Ethan with both joy and regret. Joy that Leia still spoke of him, regret that he had missed so many moments of their lives. After breakfast, Maddie insisted on helping wash the dishes. Standing on tiptoe, towel in hand, she dried each plate with determination, leaving smudges but wearing pride on her face. Ethan watched her, realizing with a pang how much of her childhood he had already lost. When she finished, she carried her photograph to the living room, curling up in a chair too large for her small frame. Ethan sat across from her, uncertainty gnawing at him. He asked softly, "Do you want to tell me more?" Maddie nodded, clutching the photo. She spoke of the cottage where they lived, the garden of flowers her mother loved, the stories they shared at night. And then, with eyes luminous in the morning light, she said, "She misses you, every day." The words cracked Ethan open. For years he had convinced himself that Leia was gone, preserved only in memory. Yet here was a child carrying proof that she lived, that she loved, that she had built a life beyond the grave he had mourned. Anger surged in him, anger at the years lost, at the lies, at the silence. But beneath it was something even more dangerous: hope. He looked at Maddie, at the green eyes so achingly familiar, and realized he could no longer cling to denial. Something in him whispered that the world was about to change. Maddie reached across the space between them, offering her small hand. Ethan hesitated, then took it. Her grip was warm, steady, and impossibly real. "It is not so lonely now, is it?" she asked quietly. His throat tightened. He shook his head, tears blurring his vision. "No, not anymore." In that moment, the cold walls of his house seemed to soften. For the first time in years, Ethan allowed himself to believe in the possibility of light after so much darkness. He sat with Maddie in the morning sun, the photograph still trembling in his hand, and felt a truth settle in his heart. Life had just begun again. The car hummed steadily as Ethan drove, Maddie's quiet directions guiding him away from the polished streets he knew into neighborhoods that felt foreign, streets lined with cracked sidewalks and faded murals. She sat beside him, small hands holding the photograph tightly as though it were a lifeline. He stole glances at her in the passenger seat, noticing how alert her eyes were, how she watched everything, too cautious for a child. Each mile pressed heavier against him, the possibility of what waited at the end both terrifying and electrifying. His heart warred between suspicion and a yearning so deep it felt carved into his bones. The lane narrowed into gravel and weeds as Maddie pointed to a weathered cottage tucked behind wild hedges. The sight of it stole Ethan's breath. Hydrangeas, dozens of them, bloomed in unruly profusion along the walkway, the same shade of blue he had carried to the cemetery for years. Maddie leapt from the car barefoot, running up the path. "Mom, I'm back," she cried, her voice clear in the still air. Ethan stepped out, his polished shoes crunching against gravel, his body trembling. The front door creaked open and a figure emerged. For a heartbeat, time stopped. Leia stood in the doorway, thinner than the woman etched into his memories, her hair streaked with silver, her face lined by years of hardship. Yet the curve of her eyes, the way her lips parted in astonishment at the sight of him, was unmistakable. Maddie threw herself into her arms and Leia bent to catch her, clutching her clothes. Ethan froze, his mind screaming this cannot be, even as his heart leapt. When Leia's gaze lifted and met his, the years collapsed in a single moment of shock and longing. Neither spoke, the silence louder than words. Ethan's throat closed around everything he wanted to ask, everything he had lost. Maddie tugged on her mother's sleeve, beaming proudly. "See, I told you he would come." Her innocent certainty pierced Ethan's chest. Leia whispered his name, her voice soft, broken. Ethan stepped closer, his body trembling like a man caught between rage and relief. "How is this possible?" he whispered. "I buried you in my heart, I mourned you every day." Leia's face crumpled. "I am sorry, Ethan, so sorry." The words cracked something inside him. Anger surged, but so did the desperate need to hold her. He demanded answers, his voice sharp with pain. She explained in fragments, the accident, the terror, her pregnancy, and the suffocating fear of his mother's disapproval. She had chosen to vanish, believing disappearance was the only way to protect her child. The revelation tore through him. He wanted to rage at her for leaving him in torment, yet seeing her alive made fury collapse into grief. He looked at the small cottage, the crayon drawings taped to the windows, the riot of blue flowers, and he understood the life she had built, fragile but real. Maddie darted inside, leaving the two of them alone. Ethan stood on the porch, hands trembling, staring at the woman he had loved and mourned. Leia's eyes filled with regret and fear. "I thought you would hate me," she whispered. Ethan shook his head, his voice cracking. "I wanted you, both of you, always." Inside the house, warmth clashed with Ethan's cold memories. The kitchen smelled of coffee and garden soil, walls crowded with books and children's art. It was cluttered, imperfect, alive. Ethan stood stiff in his immaculate suit, out of place in this world she had built. Leia poured him coffee with trembling hands. Their fingers brushed, and the touch nearly undid him. He sat at the worn table, Maddie perched between them, and listened as Leia told her story in halting detail. The night of the crash, the decision to disappear, the years of raising Maddie in quiet anonymity. Ethan's heart broke at every word, yet alongside the pain came a flicker of gratitude. She had survived, she had kept their daughter alive. For a moment, fragile peace settled over them. Then the past arrived at the hospital, embodied in Virginia Harper, Ethan's mother. She swept in like a storm, her presence as cold and sharp as ever. Her eyes fell on Leia, then Maddie, narrowing with disdain. Ethan rose instinctively, placing himself between them. Years of unspoken fury surged through him. Virginia hissed threats about legacy, reputation, and scandal, dismissing Maddie's very existence. Ethan, trembling with rage, finally broke free of her hold. "That child has my eyes, my wife's soul, and she is more family than you have ever been." His voice thundered in the sterile waiting room, a declaration that silenced even Virginia. For the first time he chose openly, without hesitation, his wife, his daughter, his family. "They are everything," he said, his voice steady, unshakable. The confrontation left scars, but also freedom. Leah, though shaken, held Ethan's hand. Maddie clutched between them. In that moment, the ghosts of fear began to fade. They left the hospital not as broken fragments, but as something resembling a family. Days turned into weeks, and Ethan sold the sterile monument of his former life, moving into a small yellow house with creaky floors and sunlight-filled rooms. He planted hydrangeas in the yard with Leah and Maddie, his hands stained with soil, laughter filling the air. For the first time in years, he did not fear getting his hands dirty. He was building again, not just a house, but a home. Evenings were filled with pancakes, music, and the sound of Maddie's giggles. Leah read aloud from old books, and Ethan would find himself staring at her, not as a ghost of grief, but as a woman still here, breathing, choosing him again. Maddie taped drawings to the refrigerator, filled the rooms with her voice, and reminded him daily that life was not about perfection but about presence. One night, beneath a trellis of fairy lights, Ethan knelt, not out of tradition but because it felt true. His voice shook as he confessed he no longer wanted to survive in silence, but to live fully with them. Leah's tears fell as she whispered yes, her arms wrapping around him, their laughter mingling with the sound of crickets. In the months that followed, forgiveness unfolded slowly, like flowers learning to trust the sun again. Virginia appeared once more, smaller than he remembered, holding a box of Leah's old books. She came not with venom but with apology, trembling as she admitted her failures. Maddie, with the innocence only a child could wield, offered her a single hydrangea. "Everyone deserves a second chance," she said softly. The words cracked open something fragile in all of them. They were not whole, not yet, but they were no longer broken beyond repair. On quiet nights, Ethan would watch his daughter draw by the window, Leah humming softly in the kitchen, and he would feel the ache of wasted years mingling with the wonder of new beginnings. Forgiveness had not erased the past, but it had given them the courage to build something new. In a house filled with blue flowers and messy laughter, Ethan finally understood. Love was not just about surviving loss, but about choosing every day to begin again. And as Maddie once told him, it was not so lonely anymore. Not anymore. There are stories that whisper, and then there are stories that roar through the silence of our lives, reminding us of truths we try so hard to forget. Ethan's journey began with grief carved so deep into his soul that he believed he would never breathe freely again. For 5 years he stood at a grave, clinging to flowers and memories, convinced that his love was buried forever. Yet life had other plans. In the shape of a barefoot child with sea-green eyes, hope returned, fragile but undeniable. Maddie became the bridge between despair and renewal, the living proof that love never truly dies. It only waits for us to find it again. When Ethan faced Leah on that worn porch surrounded by blue hydrangeas, the world shifted. Anger and sorrow collided with relief and longing, and the impossible became real. The woman he thought he lost stood before him, not as a ghost but as a survivor. Their reunion was not neat, not without scars, but it was real and it was enough. Together they began the slow, painful work of forgiveness. Forgiveness for choices made in fear, for years lost, for silence endured. And in that forgiveness, they discovered something more powerful than grief, the chance to begin again. Family, as Ethan learned, is not built in perfection but in persistence. It is in the laughter echoing off walls once empty, in the drawings taped proudly to a refrigerator, in the small hand that slips into yours and whispers, "It is not so lonely now." It is in standing firm against those who would tear you apart, and choosing every day to protect what truly matters. For Ethan, Leah, and Maddie, love became not just a memory, but a living, breathing choice. And even Virginia, hardened by pride and fear, was given a second chance through the unshakable innocence of a child's forgiveness. This story is not only about loss and recovery, it is about courage. The courage to hope when hope feels dangerous. The courage to forgive when anger feels safer. The courage to plant new roots in soil once scorched by grief, trusting that beauty can bloom again. Hydrangeas, wild and stubborn, became the symbol of this truth, that even after the harshest winters, something bright and alive can push through the cracks. And in that blossoming, we are reminded that second chances are not given, they are chosen. If this story has touched something in your heart, if it has reminded you that healing is possible even in the wake of loss, then do not let it end here. Join us because stories like this are not rare, they are everywhere waiting to be told. Subscribe to Hidden Echo Stories and let us continue sharing tales that remind us of love's resilience, of forgiveness's strength, and of the fragile, beautiful hope that carries us forward. Because sometimes the echoes of the past do not haunt us, they guide us home.